She thought the divorce left her with nothing but shame and a crumbling ruin. Mocked by her ex, ridiculed by her family, and threatened by strangers who swore the house was cursed. But when Claire Whitmore stepped inside the rotten farmhouse, she uncovered secrets sealed for generations. Trapdoors, coded ledgers, hidden vaults of gold and bonds guarded by a forgotten brotherhood. Was she handed a burden meant to break her, or a legacy meant to prove that true strength lies in enduring when everyone else walks away? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and old varnish, the kind of scent that seemed to linger in every room where lives were reduced to papers and signatures. Claire Whitmore sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly on her lap, the knuckles pale from strain. At 42, she had learned how to keep her face composed no matter what was said, but there was no disguising the deep exhaustion etched into her features. Across from her, her ex-husband Richard leaned back in his chair with the smug ease of someone who believed the game was already won. He had a new suit, a fresh haircut, and the confident smirk of a man who would leave the courtroom with more than he came in with. When the judge spoke, Claire barely heard the opening words. She caught only fragments: division of property, minimal value, no contest. It was all legal phrasing for the decision that had already been decided in practice long before this day. The house in town, the savings account, the retirement investments, all of it was parceled out in Richard's favor with the swift efficiency of a stamp pressed to paper. What remained for her was a line written in the decree with the faintest edge of disdain. The Whitmore Farmhouse, a 19th century property standing on 30 acres of overgrown land outside Stonefield, Vermont. Richard's lawyer described it with an amused sneer as a liability dressed as an asset, reminding the judge that the county had listed the structure as unsafe for occupancy. His words drew quiet chuckles from Richard's parents in the back row, a sound that reached Claire's ears with the sharpness of broken glass. She didn't look at them. She knew their faces too well. Disappointment when she had married into their family, pity when the marriage began to collapse, and now open ridicule at her supposed downfall. The judge signed the papers and pushed them forward. Claire accepted them with a nod, though the weight in her hands felt less like ownership and more like a sentence. A condemned farmhouse, its roof half collapsed, its walls bowing under decades of neglect. It had been in Richard's family for generations, abandoned when the cost of maintaining it outweighed its usefulness. Now it was hers, granted in the ledger divorce as if it were a cruel joke. When the proceedings ended, she walked past her former in-laws without slowing her step. Patricia, Richard's mother, whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She'll be lucky if the rats don't carry her off before winter." Richard laughed at that, adjusting his cufflinks as though he had just secured another victory. Claire held her silence, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on the exit doors that opened into the late Vermont afternoon. The wind outside carried the chill of approaching autumn, a sharp reminder that she had little time to decide what to do with the ruin that had been thrust into her hands. At the curb, her children waited in the old station wagon. Noah, 14 and tall for his age, leaned against the door with his arms folded, his expression guarded. Lily, only 11, clutched a sketch pad to her chest, eyes wide as she searched her mother's face for clues about what came next. Claire forced a smile as she slid behind the wheel. "It's ours now," she said, though the words tasted strange on her tongue. She did not add that others considered it worthless, or that their future now rested in the shadow of crumbling stone and rotted wood. The drive home passed in silence, the golden leaves of early October sweeping across the road in waves. Claire's mind replayed the smirks, the laughter, the condescension of voices declaring that she had lost everything. Yet beneath the humiliation was a faint thread of defiance she could not quite silence. The farmhouse might have been given to her as an insult, but it was hers, unwanted, broken, mocked by everyone who knew its history. Still, in the hollow ache of that realization, something within her stirred. The faint possibility that the story of her life was not finished, only rewritten. The news of the divorce spread through Stonefield the way it always did in a town where nothing stayed private for long. By the end of the week, it seemed everyone knew what Claire Whitmore had been left with, and just as quickly, Everyone had an opinion. In the grocery store, whispers trailed her down the aisles. Women she had once exchanged recipes with now leaned over their carts and murmured with sympathetic smiles that didn't reach their eyes. She got the farmhouse. One said, as if the word itself was a punchline, that place should have been torn down 20 years ago. The laughter that followed was soft, but sharp enough to sting. At the gas station, two men stood by the pumps and talked about her as though she were invisible. One described the farmhouse as a death trap for anyone foolish enough to step inside, while the other shook his head and remarked that Richard must have been clever to walk away with the good assets, leaving her with a pile of rotten wood. They didn't lower their voices when she stepped out her car, and when their eyes finally met hers, they gave only half-hearted nods, the kind men offer when they don't quite bother with courtesy. The cruelest whispers, however, came from within her own family. At Sunday dinner with her sister Denise, the subject surfaced before the plates had even been passed around. Denise set down her fork and sighed loudly, as though the weight of Claire's decisions had become her own burden. "I don't know why you're holding on to that wreck," she said. "Everyone in town knows it's condemned. Sell it for whatever you can get and move on. There's no sense throwing your life away chasing memories that aren't even yours." Claire said nothing, focusing instead on slicing her daughter's meat into smaller pieces, but her silence only emboldened the others. Denise's husband chuckled and muttered that Richard played the game smart, walking away with the money and leaving her with nothing but rats and a collapsing roof. Even her nieces giggled from the far end of the table, their laughter careless, cruel in its innocence. Richard himself had taken to boasting. Weeks after the settlement, he hosted a small gathering at his new house, a modern two-story on the edge of town with polished floors and a kitchen designed for display more than use. He showed off his new space to colleagues and family, pouring drinks and leading tours as if he had built it himself. When someone mentioned Claire, he smirked and lifted his glass. "She's got her farmhouse," he said, pausing long enough for the laughter to swell. "Every queen deserves her castle, right?" The room erupted, the kind of laughter that grows not from humor, but from shared disdain. Even Patricia, his mother, nodded approvingly, her eyes glinting with satisfaction at her son's clean escape. Claire heard about that evening from more than one source, each retelling flavored with amusement or pity. By the time the story reached her ears for the fourth time, she had learned to keep her expression steady, though something inside her burned. She walked the streets of Stonefield carrying that weight, the sound of their voices echoing in her mind. Every chuckle, every whisper, every sly glance pressed down upon her, reminding her of how little they expected from her now. At night, when her children were asleep, she sat at the small kitchen table of their rented apartment and stared at the farmhouse deed. The paper looked fragile, its creases already softening from a number of times she had unfolded it, as though the ink might fade away if she handled it too much. Around her, the world seemed convinced she had been left with nothing, yet holding that deed in her hands, she felt a quiet, inexplicable pull. It was not pride, not yet, and certainly not hope, but it was something steady, something that refused to yield beneath the weight of whispers and laughter. The gravel road narrowed as it wound through fields left to grow wild, the tall grasses whispering against the sides of the old station wagon. Claire gripped the wheel with both hands, her eyes fixed on the curve ahead where the land dipped and rose again, revealing what had been waiting for them since the day of the settlement. Noah sat in the passenger seat with his hood pulled up, his arms crossed in silent defiance, while Lily leaned forward between them, sketchpad clutched tightly in her lap as though ready to capture whatever they were about to see. Neither child spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the rattle of the car's suspension over neglected pavement. When the road leveled out, the farmhouse came into view. It stood behind a rusted iron gate that sagged on its hinges, the letters of the family name, Holbrook, once painted in neat black strokes, barely visible through the corrosion. Beyond the gate stretched the house itself, a long, weary structure of weather-clabbered and broken windows. The roof sloped unevenly, one side bowed from years of neglect, shingles missing in wide patches. Boards nailed haphazardly across the upper windows gave the impression of a building trying to hide its own shame. Claire parked just shy of the gate, the tires crunching to a halt in gravel that had long since merged with weeds. They sat there for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, none of them eager to be the first to move. Noah broke the silence with a flat voice that carried no curiosity, only judgment. "This is where we're supposed to live?" His eyes swept over broken porch railings, the sagging barn to the left, and the tangle of vines that had claimed most of the southern wall. Claire swallowed, her hand still resting on the wheel. "It's what we have," she said softly. The words were steady, though her chest tightened under the weight of them. She opened her door and stepped out, the crisp Vermont air rushing in with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. Lily followed, her small shoes crunching in the gravel. She pushed her hair behind her ear and tilted her head, studying the farmhouse not with fear, but with the wide-eyed gaze of an artist. "It looks like something out of a storybook," she said. "The kind where the walls remember things." Noah snorted at that, kicking a rock toward the gate. "It looks like the kind of place that should be torn down." Still, he stayed close to his mother as they walked forward, his tall frame tense, his shoulders squared as if bracing against some unseen threat. The gate groaned when Claire pushed it open, the sound echoing across the overgrown yard. Grass and weeds stretched waist-high, concealing the outlines of what had once been gardens or paths. An old well leaned near the center, its wooden cover rotted through, vines curling over its stone lip. The porch sagged visibly, boards warped and railings missing, the front door dark beneath a broken arch of ivy. Standing at the threshold of the property, Claire felt the sharp sting of memory. The courtroom laughter, the whispers in the grocery store, Richard's smug toast at his housewarming party. This was what they had left her with, a ruin dressed in shame. And yet, staring at it now, she could not shake a strange current beneath the surface, as though the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something. Lily tugged at her sleeve. "Can I draw it before we go inside?" she asked, already flipping open her sketch pad. Claire nodded. Noah shifted uncomfortably beside them, his eyes darting from the broken windows to the shadowed barn. "We shouldn't even be here," he muttered, though he did not walk away. Claire rested her hand against the cold iron of the gate, looking at the house in silence. For all its brokenness, it was theirs now, and in that quiet moment, with the autumn wind rattling the loose boards and her children standing close, she understood that whatever waited inside, they would have to face it together. The porch groaned under their weight as Claire led her children up the warped steps, her hand brushing against a railing that wobbled loosely in its socket. The air was cooler here, shaded by the overgrowth that pressed against the farmhouse walls, and for a moment she hesitated, staring at the heavy front door. Its pane had peeled away in wide strips, revealing gray wood beneath, but the iron latch still gleamed faintly when she touched it, as if time had spared this single detail. She pressed down, and with a reluctant creak, the door swung inward. The smell hit them first, a mixture of dampness, rot, and stale air that had been trapped for years. It clung to their clothes immediately, thick and earthy, and Lily raised the sleeve of her sweater over her nose. Noah muttered something under his breath, but stepped past his mother, his sneakers scuffing against the warped boards of the entryway. Each step echoed in the hollow silence, accompanied by the faint rustle of movement from somewhere deeper inside. Light filtered through the broken windows in pale shafts, catching dust that drifted in the air like ash. The once grand hallway stretched ahead, lined with faded wallpaper that had curled away from the plaster, exposing brown water stains and cracks that ran like veins. Above them, the ceiling sagged, patches of dark mold spreading across plaster that looked ready to collapse. Yet even beneath the decay, there was a strange order to the space. The stairway rose steadily at the far end, its banister intact, its carved post still sharp despite years of neglect. Claire took a careful step forward, her eyes moving from the peeling walls to the corners where abandoned nests were tucked. Birds or mice, maybe both. Noah kicked at a pile of debris, sending feathers scattering across the floor. "It's disgusting," he said flatly. His voice echoed, startling a small shape that darted from one corner to another before disappearing into the shadows. Lily clutched her sketch pad tighter, her eyes wide but curious rather than afraid. "It looks like it used to be beautiful," she whispered. Her gaze lingered on the staircase, then on the faint outline of a chandelier that still hung from the ceiling, its crystals coated with dust but catching faint hints of color when the light struck. They moved into what must have once been the parlor. The wooden floor bowed downward slightly, the boards swollen and dark from water damage. A collapsed armchair lay in one corner, its stuffing spilling out like yellowed snow, while in another corner an entire bird's nest rested atop what had once been a side table. Claire traced her hand along the mantel of fireplace, her fingers coming away black with soot and grit. She looked at the faded tiles surrounding it, each decorated with delicate blue patterns that had somehow survived the years, their color still visible beneath the grime. The kitchen was worse. Rusted pipes hung exposed beneath the sink, and the ceiling above showed gaping holes where water had seeped down, staining everything below. Broken cabinets leaned off their hinges, the handles dangling loosely. Yet even here, there was an odd sense of preservation, as though the decay had stopped at a certain point. Jars still lined the shelves, sealed dusty, their contents long since clouded but intact. A pan rested on the stove as if abandoned mid-use, a frozen moment from decades earlier. Noah frowned, pulling open one of the drawers to reveal old utensils still in place. "It's like someone just walked away," he said. Claire nodded, her throat tight. There was no sign of vandals, no graffiti, no shattered furniture scattered in anger. It was all simply left, as though the house had chosen to keep its secrets untouched. They climbed the staircase cautiously, each step groaning, but holding firm beneath their weight. The upstairs hall was darker. The windows here boarded more thoroughly, but through gaps in the wood, thin blades of light revealed faded wallpaper patterned with vines and flowers. A child's shoe lay abandoned against the wall. Lily bent to pick it up, her brow furrowing. "Who lived here?" she asked quietly. Claire took it from her gently and set it back down. "Families," she said. "Once." They explored only a few rooms before the smell of damp plaster drove them back toward the staircase. Beds still stood, their frames rusted, their mattresses collapsed inward. In one room, an entire ceiling panel had fallen, scattering lath and plaster across the floor like the aftermath of a storm. In another, faint writing marked the wall near the window, initials carved by a hand that had long since vanished. When they returned to the hallway, Claire paused at the landing and looked down over the entry. The air still smelled of rot and mold, and yet, standing there, she felt the unmistakable weight of something preserved beneath the ruin, as though the house had been waiting for them. Noah shifted impatiently beside her, eager to leave, but Lily stared into the dim light with a kind of reverence, her pencil already moving across her sketch pad. Claire exhaled slowly, her hand tightening on the banister. The house was broken, yes, but not defeated. Something remained, hidden in the silence, and though she couldn't yet name it, she felt the certainty that they had only touched the surface of what this farmhouse still held. The memory of the courthouse returned to Claire with unnerving clarity as she stood in the farmhouse entry, the smell of mildew thick in her lungs. It came back in fragments at first. The scrape of chairs on a polished floor, the shuffle of papers passed from clerk to judge, the sterile air of a room where the most personal parts of her life had been broken down into assets and debts. She had thought she could endure it with dignity, that she could sit across from Richard and accept the division without letting him see her falter. But the words spoken that day clung to her, sharper now than when she first heard them. The judge had cleared his throat, tapping the end of his pen against a stack of documents before looking directly at her. "As for the farmhouse property," he had said, his voice measured and deliberately impersonal, "its market appraisal is negligible. The county lists it in a state of disrepair. At best, it holds minimal value." The phrase echoed in the hushed courtroom, delivered with the finality of a gavel though none had struck yet. Minimal value, a polite legal way of saying worthless. Richard's smirk followed immediately, that practiced half-smile he wore whenever he believed he had outmaneuvered her. He leaned back in his chair, fingers brushing against the cuff of his shirt, his gold watch catching the light. To him, it wasn't simply about winning. It was about seeing her lose in a way that others could witness, about ensuring that when she walked out of that courtroom, she carried not only the weight of disappointment, but the humiliation of appearing diminished. She had wanted to look away, to let her gaze drop to the polished table before her, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. She saw satisfaction there, cold and unapologetic, as if the farmhouse deed was less a piece of property than a curse he had arranged for her to bear. Her attorney, well-meaning but weary, had leaned in and whispered that it was better this way. Better to accept the farmhouse than to fight over assets that would only drain her with legal fees. At least it's something, he had murmured, though she could tell by his tone that even he did not believe it. The rest of the courtroom seemed to absorb the judgment without pause. Clerks scribbled notes. The bailiff shifted by the door, and Richard's lawyer smiled as though the conclusion had always been obvious. When the gavel finally struck and the decree was set, Claire felt the room tilt slightly, not from surprise, but from the quiet realization that her life had been reduced to a ruin mocked in whispers. She remembered walking past Richard's parents as they rose from their seats, the older woman's hand resting on her husband's arm as she shook her head in pity. Pity, or perhaps triumph. It was hard to distinguish. Patricia's voice had carried as she said, "She got what she deserves," a sentence spoken not to Claire but to the room, as though her humiliation should be a matter of public record. Now, standing in the dim light of the farmhouse foyer, Claire could still feel the sting of those words and that smirk. Minimal value. She repeated the phrase in her mind, testing its weight. It was meant to dismiss, to define the farmhouse as nothing more than a burden. Yet the house around her whispered something different. Even through the warped floors and mold-stained walls, there was a presence she could not ignore, a stubborn defiance that matched the quiet anger simmering in her chest. She thought of Richard's new home, the laughter that had filled its bright rooms during his housewarming. She remembered the glasses raised and toasts, the sly remarks about her inheritance. They had wanted her to carry this house as proof of failure, but as she placed her hand against the banister, feeling the solid wood beneath her palm, she wondered if perhaps they had miscalculated. What if the curse they had handed her was not ruin, but a challenge? What if minimal value was only the judgment of those too blind to see deeper? The judge's words would remain with her, etched into the record of her life. But they would not be the end of her story. As the farmhouse creaked around her in the gathering dusk, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Let them laugh, she thought. The house was hers now, and for the first time since the decree, she felt a flicker of something stronger than shame. She felt the first spark of defiance. The air inside the farmhouse seemed heavier after the sun began to slip lower, shadows lengthening across the warped floorboards and making every corner feel more distant. Claire moved slowly from room to room, careful where she stepped, her children trailing behind with a mix of curiosity and unease. They had seen enough of the main hall and the parlor, enough of the collapsed furniture and mold-darkened walls, and were ready to retreat back to the car. But something compelled her deeper into the house, as if the silence itself was urging her not to leave so quickly. In what must once have been a sitting room, against the far wall, she found a narrow wooden dresser, its surface warped from years of dampness. One of the drawers sagged open slightly, the brass handle tarnished to a dull green. She pulled it gently, half expecting it to crumble in her hands, but the drawer slid out with a soft rasp. Inside lay a scattering of objects, brittle scraps of paper, a cracked fountain pen, and beneath them, a neat stack of photographs bound together with a faded ribbon. Claire paused, the weight of the moment pressing down on her as she lifted them out. The ribbon disintegrated at her touch, leaving the photographs loose in her hands. They were sepia, the kind she had only ever seen in museum displays or antique shops, their edges frayed but their images surprisingly sharp. She held the first one to the light. A family stood in front of the very farmhouse she was standing in now, though in a photograph it appeared strong and new. The clapboard siding was bright, the porch straight and welcoming. A man with bristled beard and stern eyes stood beside a woman in a long dress, her hair pinned back severely. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood between them, their expressions carefully composed as if warned not to smile. Noah leaned closer, peering over his mother's shoulder. "That's this house," he said, his voice flat with realization. The angle of the photograph left no doubt. The porch posts, the arch above the door, even the iron gate in the background matched what still remained outside. Lily stepped closer too, holding the corner of the picture gently. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice hushed as though the figures might hear. Claire flipped the photograph over. Faded ink scrawled across the back read, "The Holbrooks, 1882. She turned to the next image. It was the same family, this time gathered inside what appeared to be the parlor. The chandelier hung above them, glittering, and the wallpaper was still bright with pattern. The man sat rigid in a high-backed chair, the woman beside him. The children posed stiffly at their feet. Their faces were not smiling here either, but their eyes seemed alive, alert, unwilling to be softened by the camera's long exposure. One after another, Claire studied the photographs. The family at the well, the children standing near a wooden fence, the woman holding a book on the porch, her gaze fixed on the lens with quiet defiance. Each image carried the same unshaken intensity, a refusal to fade even as the years had turned everything around them to ruin. Lily traced a fingertip over the woman's outline. "She doesn't look afraid," she said softly, "even though she's not smiling." Claire nodded, feeling something stir in her chest. There was strength in those faces, a resilience that seemed to seep through the paper despite the century that separated them. It was as though the Holbrooks had known hardship, had seen the uncertainty of the world, and had chosen to look straight at it without flinching. Noah shifted uneasily. "They're all dead now," he muttered, as if to remind his sister that photographs were only shadows of people long gone. But his own eyes lingered on the images longer than he intended, as though drawn to the same quiet defiance. Claire placed the photographs back into the drawer, her fingers trembling slightly. She knew nothing of the Holbrooks beyond what the pictures suggested, yet in their steady gazes she felt an unexpected kinship. The judge had called this place worthless. Her family and neighbors saw only rot. Richard smirked at the thought of her trapped with a burden he no longer wanted. But these photographs told a different story. This house had been built by people who endured, people who had stood exactly where she now stood and claimed it as their own. She closed the drawer carefully, the image of their faces still etched in her mind. The farmhouse was falling apart, yes, but it had not surrendered to time. And neither, she realized, would she. The farmhouse settled into darkness like a ship drifting into deep waters, each board shifting and groaning as the night wind pressed against its frame. Claire spread the sleeping bags across the living room floor, clearing away dust and broken plaster as best she could. The fireplace was useless, the chimney clogged with years of neglect, so they relied on the small camping lantern she had brought from the apartment. Its weak glow barely touched the corners of the room, leaving the walls in shadow and the ceiling beams hidden above in darkness. The smell of mold was stronger at night, the dampness rising from the floor as though the house itself was breathing. Noah lay stiffly in his sleeping bag, his head pulled over his head, while Lily curled beside him, already sketching by lantern light, as if the day's images refused to leave her. She had drawn the porch, the leaning gate, and even the cracked windows, her pencil lines capturing details that Claire herself had barely noticed. Claire sat quietly against the wall, watching them, her own exhaustion pressing heavily against her, but refusing to let her drift into sleep. This house was unfamiliar, and though she had tried to convince her children it was safe, she felt the weight of its silence pressing in. The wind rose outside, whistling through broken panes, and somewhere above them a shutter banged rhythmically, loose on its hinge. The sound carried to the rafters like footsteps, and Lily paused in her drawing to glance upward. "It's just the wind," Claire said softly, though she tightened her grip on her blanket. Lily nodded but pulled the covers up to her chin, her wide eyes fixed on the ceiling until they drooped with sleep. The hours dragged slowly. Claire found herself listening to every sound, each creak and sigh of the old beams shifting. Somewhere in the walls, mice scurried, their tiny claws scratching faintly. The house felt alive, not in a menacing way, but in a restless way, as though it resented being left in silence for so long. It reminded her of a weary animal, and used of visitors but unwilling to fully reject them. It was well past midnight when Noah stirred. He rolled onto his side, pressing his ear against the sleeping bag and frowning. Then he shifted again, this time pressing his ear to the bare floorboards beneath him. Claire noticed his movement and whispered, "What is it?" He held up a hand, signaling for quiet, his brows furrowed in concentration. "Listen," he mouthed. Claire leaned closer, lowering her ear toward the floor. At first, she heard nothing beyond the steady groan of the wind. But then, faintly, she caught it, the hollow resonance beneath the boards, not solid like the rest of the floor. "It sounds empty," Noah whispered. He knocked lightly with his knuckles, and the sound that returned was sharper, as though a space lay beneath. Lily stirred in her sleep at the noise, rolling closer to her mother, but did not wake. Claire reached out quickly, laid her hand over Noah's before he knocked again. "Not now," she murmured. His eyes were sharp in the dim lantern light, a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, but he nodded reluctantly and settled back onto the sleeping bag. Still, neither of them could ignore it. The board beneath them were uneven, patched and replaced in some areas, but here in the living room, there was a distinct difference. Hollow, as though something waited beneath. Claire lay back down, closing her eyes, but sleep refused to come. Her thoughts circled endlessly, recalling the Holbrook photographs, the judge's words, Richard's smirk, and now this strange resonance beneath her feet. She could almost imagine the house whispering to her, reminding her that what everyone dismissed as worthless still had something left to reveal. The lantern sputtered, its glow dimming before finally giving out. The darkness swallowed the room completely, leaving only the faint silver of moonlight to the broken boards of the window. The wind carried a low moan through the house, blending with the faint hollow sound Claire now imagined she could hear even without Noah knocking. She drew her children closer, pulling their blankets around them, her heart steadying itself against the rhythm of the house's breathing. Somewhere beneath those warped boards lay a secret, and whether it was curse or salvation, it belonged now to them. Morning light revealed the farmhouse in a way the lantern never could, its frailties more glaring, its decay impossible to ignore. Claire stood on the porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee, the air sharp with the chill of autumn. Her children were inside, still bundled in their sleeping bags, and for a moment she allowed herself to watch the mist rise from the fields, drifting low and silver across the overgrown grass. The silence of the place was heavy but oddly calming, as if the land itself had accepted her presence even if no one else had. That calm didn't last. By late morning, the sound of tires crunching on gravel reached her ears, and when she turned, Denise's familiar SUV pulled up in front of the leaning gate. Her sister stepped out in pressed slacks and a tailor coat, her hair pinned neatly as if she had a meeting afterward. She looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of sagging clapboard and creeping vines. Denise scanned the house once before shaking her head, her lips pursed in the way they always were when she believed she was right, which was often. "So it's true," she said, approaching the porch. "You actually brought the kids here." Claire didn't answer at first, just sipped her coffee and studied her sister's expression. Denise had been repeating the same refrain since the divorce proceedings began. Don't get sentimental. Don't cling to scraps. Cut your losses and move on. It had been advice spoken like a command, wrapped in concern but dripping with judgment. Now she was here in person to deliver it once more. "You can't stay here," Denise continued, her heels sinking slightly in the soft ground as she stepped closer. "Claire, look at this place. It's falling apart. You're not going to fix it. You're not going to make it something it hasn't been in decades." She glanced toward the windows, boarded and broken, and lowered her voice as if the house itself might overhear. "Sell it before it takes more from you. Don't throw away more years chasing ghosts." Inside, Noah stirred, and through the open doorway, Claire saw him sit up listening. He didn't step outside, but his presence was enough to keep her from answering too quickly. Lily still slept beside him, her sketch pad open on her chest, a half-finished drawing of the staircase visible on the page. Claire set her coffee cup on the railing and finally turned to face her sister. "It's mine now," she said, her voice even. Denise sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. "That's exactly the problem. They dumped this ruin on you because they knew you wouldn't fight back. Richard knew it would weigh you down, and you let him hand you a curse with a bow on top." Her eyes softened briefly, but it was the softness of someone certain she was rescuing a fool. "You've got 2 kids who need stability, not mold and broken beams. Take the money while you still can. At least then you'll have something." Claire felt the sting of the words, but kept her gaze steady. The judge's phrase, "minimal value," echoed in her mind alongside Richard's smirk. Denise thought she was protecting her, but beneath it all was the same dismissiveness everyone else carried. They saw only ruin, never possibility. Noah appeared in the doorway now, his hood pulled up, his expression guarded. "We're not selling," he said firmly before Claire could speak. Denise blinked at him, startled by the interruption. "Sweetheart, you don't understand." But Noah cut her off, his voice sharper. "No, you don't." He turned and disappeared back inside, leaving silence in his wake. Denise's mouth tightened. She looked back at Claire, shaking her head once more. "Don't drag him into this. Don't drag them both into something you know you can't fix." Claire didn't argue. She let the silence stand, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the tall grass. She knew Denise would leave believing she had won the conversation, that sooner or later her sister's warnings would come true. But as the SUV pulled away and the gravel settled back into quiet, Claire felt something different. The farmhouse was broken, yes, but it was also stubborn, standing after more than a century of storms and winters. For the first time in years, she felt herself mirrored in its endurance. The pantry was a narrow, dim space at the back of the farmhouse, its shelves sagging under the weight of dust and forgotten jars. The air was cooler there, still heavy with the smell of damp wood, but sharper somehow, as if the walls themselves held on to the scent of grain and preserves long since gone. Claire had brought the children inside to help her take stock of what might still be usable, though the cracked shelves and warped floorboards left little to hope for. Lily trailed her fingers along the plaster wall as she moved, her sketch pad tucked under one arm, her eyes darting to every detail as though she were already capturing it in her mind. Noah was less patient. He leaned against the doorway with his hood up, his arms folded across his chest, muttering under his breath about how pointless it all was. "There's nothing here, Mom. It's just garbage." He kicked at a rusted tin can that clattered across the floor, his frustration filling the small space. Claire ignored the remark, crouching to open a warped cabinet door near the floor. Inside were glass jars with clouded contents, their labels long faded, some cracked and leaking. She sighed, already feeling the weight of Denise's words in the morning pressing back against her. It was Lily who noticed the irregular patch of plaster. She had been tracing the wall absently when her fingertip caught on a rough edge, a crack that zigzagged unevenly as if someone had covered something in haste. She paused, leaning closer, brushing dust away with her sleeve. "Mom," she said softly, "look here." Claire rose and crossed the pantry, crouching beside her daughter. At first it seemed nothing more than age, another crack in a house full of them. But Lily tapped the spot lightly, and the sound that came back was different, hollow, muted. She looked at her mother, her eyes wide with that spark of curiosity that had carried her through every discovery since they arrived. There's something behind it. They worked together, carefully pulling at the weak plaster until a small piece broke away. Beneath the chalky dust was a corner of something flat and solid, wedged tightly into the space between studs. Lily's small fingers slipped inside, tugging gently until at last she pulled free a leather-bound book. The cover was worn and flaking, the leather cracked but still intact, its clasp rusted but holding. Claire brushed away the plastered dust, her heart thudding in her chest. She opened it slowly, half expecting the pages to crumble to ash, but the binding held. Inside, lines of neat handwriting stretched across yellowed pages. The ink faded but legible. At first glance it appeared to be a farm ledger. Lists of crops, tallies of livestock, records of harvest and sales. But scattered among the ordinary entries were strange markings, symbols drawn in the margins, circles and lines interwoven like patterns meant to be understood only by those who knew the code. Lily leaned over eagerly, her eyes following the shapes. "It's not just numbers," she whispered. She pointed to a page where a tally of corn bushels was flanked by intricate spirals, repeated again beside an entry for wheat. "See? It means something." Noah stepped closer despite himself, his skepticism breaking under curiosity. "Or it's just doodles," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He reached out to turn the page, revealing another series of tallies accompanied by small geometric designs. Triangles nested inside circles, arrows pointing in opposing directions. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, nothing like idle scribbles. Claire traced one of the symbols with her fingertip. It stirred a memory of the photographs they had found, the defiant eyes of the Holbrooks staring back at the camera as if guarding a secret. This ledger might belong to them, their records, their coded notes buried within the daily rhythm of farm life. They carried the book back into the living room, sitting together on the dusty floor. Claire read aloud the dates, entries from the 1880s, each season carefully recorded. Lily sketched the symbols into her notebook beside her mother, replicating them with a care that suggested she understood their importance. Noah frowned, staring at the pages as if trying to force logic onto them. "Why hide this in the wall?" he asked. "If it was just crops, they could have left it on a shelf." Claire closed the book gently, the leather creaking. "Because maybe it wasn't just crops," she said. Her voice was quiet, almost to herself. She thought of the hollow sound beneath the living room floor, of the photographs with eyes that refused to soften, and now of this ledger with its hidden language disguised as routine. The farmhouse groaned as the wind pressed against it, but the three of them sat still, the book heavy in Claire's lap. It was no longer only a ruin. It was beginning to speak, in whispers of symbols and secrets carried forward through time. And she realized with certainty that whatever had been left here, it had not been meant to disappear. It had been meant to be found. The knock at the door startled all three of them. It was late morning, the air still cool from the night, and Claire had been bent over the ledger at the kitchen table, tracing the strange symbols again while Lily copied them into her sketch pad. Noah sat slouched nearby, fiddling with a loose nail he'd pried from one of the warp boards. When the sound came again, sharp, impatient. For a moment, Claire hesitated. No one visited the farmhouse. The driveway was hidden by tall weeds, and neighbors rarely bothered to come this far. When she opened the door, a man stood on the porch with a clipboard tucked under his arm. His khaki jacket bore the insignia of the county, and his expression was the practiced neutrality of someone used to delivering unwelcome news. He removed his cap, glanced briefly inside at the children, and then back at her with a look that already carried judgment. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, flipping a page on his clipboard. "Yes," she said cautiously. "I'm with the county inspection office. We received a report that the Holbrook farmhouse had been reoccupied. By law, I'm required to assess the condition of the structure and determine its safety." He spoke with clipped efficiency, already moving past her into the entryway without waiting for an invitation. Claire bristled, but said nothing as he walked through the rooms, jotting notes on his form. He tapped at the sagging ceiling with a pen, frowned at the mold stains on the plaster, and shook his head as he tested the banister of the staircase. Each sound of his pen scratching against the clipboard seemed to deepen the pit in her stomach. When he returned to the front hall, he spoke without meeting her eyes. "This property is officially condemned, structurally unsound. The floors are unstable, the roof is beyond repair, and there are clear signs of water infiltration. No one should be living here." Lily clutched the ledger closer to her chest, retreating behind her mother, while Noah narrowed his eyes, his jaw tightening as though he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. The inspector cleared his throat and continued. "You'll receive a written notice within the week. By law, you'll have 60 days to either make the necessary repairs, which I'll tell you now will be cost prohibitive, or have the house demolished. Failure to comply will result in daily fines until the property is brought into compliance." He slid a paper from his folder and handed it to her. The word condemned was stamped in red across the top, glaring against the white sheet. Claire stared at it, her fingers tightening until the page crumpled slightly. 60 days, she repeated quietly, more to herself than to him. He nodded, tucking his pen into his pocket. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I know this place has history, but sometimes history just can't be saved." He replaced his cap, gave her a perfunctory nod, and stepped back onto the porch. Moments later, his truck rumbled down the gravel road, leaving only a cloud of dust behind. Silence fell heavy in the house. Noah broke it first. "They just want to tear it down," he said bitterly. "They don't even care what's here." He looked toward the pantry where the ledger had been found, as if the symbols inside were proof that the inspector was wrong. Claire folded the notice carefully, slipping it into the pocket of her jacket. Her heart was pounding, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "Let them say what they want," she murmured. "This place isn't finished yet." She thought of photographs, the hollow sound beneath the floor, the coded ledger hidden behind plaster. All of it felt deliberate, preserved through decades as if waiting for someone to find it. 60 days was a deadline, but it was also time enough to uncover what the farmhouse still held before anyone could take it away. She glanced at her children, their faces tense but expectant, and for the first time since stepping into the house, she felt not just burdened but resolute. The county might see only rot, but she was beginning to see something else, something that refused to be erased. The invitation had arrived in the mail 2 weeks earlier, a heavy cream-colored envelope with Richard's handwriting on the front. Claire had considered ignoring it, had even thought about tearing it in half before Lily's curious eyes convinced her otherwise. It was an invitation to Richard's parents' annual autumn gathering, a tradition she had once been part of when she still bore his name. Against her better judgment, she went. Part of her told herself it was for the children, so they would not feel cut off entirely from family, though another part of her suspected she went because she refused to let them believe she had vanished into obscurity. The Whitmore house glowed warm from the outside, light spilling from tall windows, the driveway lined with cars. Claire parked near the end, her old station wagon looking out of place among the polished sedans and SUVs. Noah and Lily trailed behind her as they stepped inside, the smell of roasted meat and cinnamon clinging to the air. Laughter drifted through the rooms, accompanied by the clink of glasses and the faint strains of piano music. Eyes turned toward her almost immediately. Some faces were polite, offering practiced smiles, but others carried that familiar shade of amusement, as though her presence itself was a reminder of failure. Denise had been right about one thing. People had not forgotten the divorce or its settlement. Richard spotted her near the threshold of the dining room, his hand resting easily on the shoulder of a colleague as he recounted some story. He wore a navy jacket, his hair neatly combed, his confidence radiating in every gesture. When he noticed her, his smile broadened, but it was not a smile of welcome. It was a smile of a man who had already prepared his lines. "Claire," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the room. Conversations paused. "So good of you to join us. I hear you've settled into your inheritance." The word lingered in the air, sharpened with mockery. Claire met his gaze steadily, though her hands tightened around the strap of her purse. "We're making it work," she said simply. Richard chuckled, shaking his head as though her answer amused him more than it should have. "Making it work? Claire, that place is a museum for rats. I'm surprised the county hasn't condemned it yet." His remark was met with laughter from those gathered near him, short, cruel bursts of sound that spread quickly across the room. Someone added, "I wouldn't set foot in that place without a tetanus shot," and more laughter followed. Lily stood close at her mother's side, her small hand clutching Claire's coat tightly. Noah's jaw clenched, his eyes flashing with anger as he glared at his father. But Claire remained still, her face unreadable. She let the laughter wash over her without response, though every word cut deeply. Richard raised his glass in a mock toast. "To Claire," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "A queen in her castle." The room erupted again, glasses lifted, eyes sparkling with amusement at her expense. For a moment, Claire considered leaving, taking her children by the hand, and walking out into the night. But instead, she straightened her shoulders and remained where she was, her gaze fixed on Richard until his smirk faltered just slightly. She didn't return his toast, didn't offer him the satisfaction of rising to his bait. She simply stood, silent and steady, as though rooted like the beams of the farmhouse itself. Eventually the laughter faded, replaced by the shifting noise of other conversations, the sting of the moment already dissolving for those who had delivered it. But for Claire, it remained, carved into her memory alongside the judge's words, alongside every whisper in the grocery store. It burned, yes, but it also hardened something within her. Later, when she guided her children back to the car, Lily looked up at her and whispered, "It's not a museum for rats." Noah, still seething, muttered, "He doesn't know anything." Claire said nothing, but in the darkness of the drive home, she felt the truth pressing against her chest. Richard could mock her farmhouse all he wanted, but the house had already begun to reveal pieces of itself that he would never understand. His laughter might echo for now, but she knew, deep down, that it would not be the final word. The dining room had become the place they gathered when the evenings grew too heavy with silence. The table, though covered in dust and tilted slightly where one leg had warped, still stood in the center of the room. Claire spread blankets over it, so they could sit together while she read to the ledger or helped Lily sketch. The boarded windows let in narrow blades of light during the day, but at night the room belonged to the lantern's glow, its flicker throwing long shadows against the faded wallpaper. It was on one such evening that Noah, restless and impatient as always, decided to pry at the floor rather than sit still with his sister's drawings. He had noticed it before, the rug beneath the table that seemed too deliberate in a house where so much had been left in disarray. It was a heavy thing, patterned with faded roses, its edges stiff with dust, unlike the rest of the clutter scattered across the house. This rug looked as though it had been placed with purpose. He shoved the table aside despite his mother's warning that he'd scratched the wood, then bent down and began pulling at the corners. Claire looked up from the ledger, her brow furrowing. "Noah, what are you doing?" "There's something under here," he muttered, tugging harder until the rug gave a reluctant groan and peeled back. Dust billowed into the air, making him cough. Lily set down her sketch pad and scrambled closer, her eyes bright with curiosity. Together they rolled the rug back until the bare floorboards were exposed. That was when Noah saw it clearly, an outline cut into the wood, square and unmistakable, its edges reinforced with iron fittings that had dulled to black with age. "It's a door," he said, tapping it with the heel of his hand. The sound echoed differently than the rest of the floor, hollow and deep. Claire rose slowly, her eyes fixed on the outline. She knelt beside her children, brushing dust away with her sleeve. The trapdoor was sealed tightly, the iron fittings bolted into place. A small ring handle lay flush with the wood, rusted but intact. Noah hooked his fingers through it and pulled with all his strength. The wood groaned but did not give. He tried again, bracing his feet, his face tightening with effort, but the door remained shut. "It won't move," he said, frustrated. He looked at his mother, his eyes sparking with challenge. "Help me?" Claire wrapped her hand around the iron ring and pulled. The cold metal bit into her palm, the muscles in her arms straining, but the door held firm. Whatever lay beneath had been meant to stay hidden. She sat back, catching her breath, staring at the sealed square in the floor. Lily crouched low, pressing her ear against the wood. "It sounds empty underneath," she whispered, "like there's space down there." The three of them lingered in silence, the lantern's light flickering over their faces. The farmhouse had already given them fragments of its past, the photographs, the ledger, the symbols scrawled in margins. But this was different. This was a promise, a secret kept behind iron and wood, waiting. Noah slammed his fist against it once, the sound reverberating through the room. "We'll open it," he said, his voice low but certain. Claire touched his shoulder, steadying him. "Not tonight," she murmured. "This house has waited this long. It can wait a little longer." But even as she said it, she felt the truth settle inside her. Whatever had been hidden beneath, that trapdoor was not gone. It was still there, sealed away for reasons she did not yet understand. And sooner or later, they would break it open. The trapdoor lingered in Claire's mind long after they had rolled the rug back across it. She could feel its presence beneath the dining room floor, waiting with a kind of stubborn patience that matched the house itself. Every time she stepped across that section of wood, the hollow echo beneath reminded her of what they had not yet opened. Noah returned to it daily, crouching beside the iron ring and tugging in frustration, while Lily sketched the outline in her notebook as though the act of drawing it might reveal its secret. Claire herself resisted the urge to pry at it again, telling herself that when the time came, they would find a way. It was 2 days later when she stumbled upon the key. She'd been clearing debris from the upstairs hall, sweeping plaster and broken wood into piles near the window. The floorboards were uneven, some warped with water damage, others split with age. She pressed her broom across one of them and felt the wood shift beneath her weight, the edge rising slightly. Kneeling, she pried at it with her fingers until the board lifted with a reluctant creak. Beneath it lay a shallow cavity, lined with dust and spiderwebs. At first she thought it was empty, just another sign of the house's decline. But then she saw the glint of metal in the corner. Reaching in, she pulled out a small iron key, its surface blackened with rust, the teeth still sharp and deliberate. It was heavier than she expected, its weight solid in her hand, as though it had been waiting for her. She turned it over slowly, studying the intricate groove along its shaft. This was not a modern key. It belonged to an older world, a world that built trapdoors and locked them with iron. Claire's breath caught in her throat as realization settled. She didn't need to wonder what it was meant for. She carried it downstairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. Noah looked up immediately when she entered the dining room, his eyes narrowing at the object in her hand. "What's that?" Claire held it out so they both could see. "A key," she said simply. Lily set down her sketch pad, her face alight with excitement. "Does it fit?" They gathered around the rug, rolling it back once more to expose the trapdoor. The iron ring looked darker in the dim light, the fittings rigid and unyielding. Claire knelt beside it, the key cool and steady in her palm. She slid it into a narrow slot near the ring, one she hadn't noticed before, disguised beneath a crust of dust and grime. The teeth caught, grinding slightly, and then slid whole with a sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It fit. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The key remained in place, waiting for her to turn it. Claire wrapped her fingers around it and gave a gentle twist. The mechanism resisted at first, stiff with age, then shifted with a low groan, the iron fittings loosening their grip. The trapdoor shuddered slightly, as if releasing a breath it had been holding for decades. Noah crouched closer, his hand hovering over the ring. "Can we open it now?" His voice trembled with both eagerness and unease. Claire pulled the key free, her heart pounding. She wanted to say yes, to give in to the urgency in his eyes and the curiosity burning in her own. But something held her back, a caution she couldn't ignore. "Not yet," she said quietly. "We will, but not tonight." Noah groaned, leaning back on his heels, but he didn't argue. Lily, on the other hand, was staring at the trapdoor as though it had spoken to her. She whispered almost to herself, "It was waiting for us." Claire replaced the rug, the outline of the trapdoor hidden once more, though its presence pressed against the floor like a heartbeat. The key she slipped into her pocket, its weight a constant reminder. She knew she would turn it again, sooner rather than later. The house was revealing its secrets piece by piece, and she could feel the rhythm of discovery building. What lay beneath that trapdoor might change everything, but for now it remained sealed, patient as the house itself. The day they finally chose to open the trapdoor, the air inside the farmhouse felt charged, as though the house itself sensed what was about to happen. Claire knelt on the dining room floor with the black key in hand. Noah crouched beside her, and Lily leaned in close with her sketch pad forgotten at her side. The rug had been rolled back, the dust brushed away, and now the iron fittings gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Claire slid the key into place, twisted it with both hands, and heard the mechanism unlock with a groan that seemed to reverberate through the entire room. Noah wasted no time. He gripped the iron ring, pulled with a grunt, and the trapdoor finally gave, its hinges shrieking as it lifted open. The smell that rose from the darkness was damp and old, tinged with a sour bite of stone and soil. A chill drifted upward, brushing against their faces as if the earth itself exhaled. Claire lowered the lantern over the opening, its light spilling into the void below, illuminating a narrow staircase made of stone that descended into shadow. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then Noah stepped forward, his hand tight on the lantern handle. "I'll go first," he said, his voice steady though his eyes flickered with nerves. Claire shook her head. "We go together," she replied. She placed one hand on his shoulder, the other guiding Lily toward the opening. The three of them descended slowly, each step echoing in confined space. The basement floor was uneven, packed dirt with patches of stone, the walls lined with rough-hewn blocks. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying in steady rhythm. The lantern light revealed shelves against the walls. They were warped but still upright, laden with dusty jars. Claire stepped closer, wiping one clean with her sleeve. Inside floated something unrecognizable, long since clouded with age. Rows of them stretched along the shelves, each sealed tight, each bearing faint labels too faded to read. Beside the jars lay tools, rusted shovels, iron picks, wooden handles worn smooth from use. Some had broken and been left behind. Others leaned neatly against the wall as if abandoned mid-task. At the far end of the basement sat crates stacked 2 and 3 high, their surfaces coated in grime, but their edges sharp and solid. Noah ran his hand across one, his fingers leaving streaks in the dust. "These have been here forever," he whispered. Claire knelt beside a crate and brushed at the lid. Wax sealed the edges, thick and deliberate. She traced it with her fingertips, her mind racing with possibilities. Why seal crates in a basement and leave them untouched? Who had packed them, and what had they intended to hide? Lily's eyes roamed across the shelves, wide with fascination. She lifted her sketch pad, her pencil already moving across the page as she captured the scene. The dripping stone walls, the shelves of jars, the looming crates like silent guardians. "It feels like they meant us to find this," she murmured. Claire didn't answer. She was listening to the silence, to the way the basement seemed to hum beneath the sound of dripping water. It was not a place of ruin like the rest of the house. Here, things had been preserved. Even the air felt different, cooler, steadier, as though sealed off from decay above. Noah tapped the lid of one crate with his knuckles. The hollow thud made him grin. "There's something inside," he said. He reached for the rusted crowbar leaning nearby, but Claire caught his hand. "Not yet," she said firmly. "We need to be careful." Her eyes lingered on the crates, then drifted to the shelves and the tools. Everything here had been placed with purpose, not discarded. This basement wasn't storage. It was a vault, a hidden place meant to endure long after its makers were gone. They stood together in the lantern glow, the air damp and heavy around them, the shelves and crates waiting silently. Above them, the farmhouse creaked as the wind moved through its broken windows, but down here it was different. The walls seemed to close around them, not in menace but in secrecy. The first ascent had given them more than they expected, proof that the house was not just a ruin. It was a keeper of things forgotten, and now, those things belonged to them. The basement's silence pressing on them, broken only by the faint drip of water and the shuffle of their footsteps across the uneven ground. The lanterns glowed through uneven shadows on the walls, making the stone blocks appear to shift and breathe. Claire trailed her hand along the rough surface as she walked, her fingertips brushing against the grit of age. The walls were solid, built thick, but as she moved toward the far corner, something about the sound changed. Each step echoed differently, the air cooler there, as if the stone itself was thinner. She stopped, running her palm flat across one section of wall. It looked no different than the others. Gray, rough-hewn blocks fitted tightly together. But when she tapped it with her knuckles, the sound came back hollow, not the dull thud of packed stone, but a muted resonance, as though a cavity waited behind. Claire frowned, tapping again. Noah's head snapped up immediately. "What is it?" he asked, already moving toward her. "Listen," Claire murmured. She stepped back and knocked once more, harder this time. The hollow echo was undeniable. Noah pressed his ear to the wall, then grinned despite himself. "There's something back there." Lily clutched her sketch pad closer, her eyes wide. "Maybe it's another room," she whispered. Claire glanced around, spotting a rusted chisel among the tools left against the shelves. She picked it up, its handle worn smooth with age, and handed it to Noah. Together they worked at the mortar between the stones, scraping and prying until flakes of dust filled the air. The stone was stubborn, but time had weakened the seams. With each strike, the hollow sound grew louder, as though the wall were a shell about to crack. At last, one of the blocks shifted. Claire braced her hands against it, pushing with all her weight. The stone slid forward and fell with a dull thud onto the dirt floor, sending a cloud of dust swirling. The lantern light spilled into the cavity beyond, illuminating the edge of wooden crates stacked tightly against each other, their surfaces dark but intact. Noah exhaled in disbelief. "There's more." They pulled away another stone, then another, until the opening was wide enough to see inside. The space beyond was narrow, little more than a hidden chamber, but it was filled with crates. Each one was sealed at the edges with thick wax, the faint remains of red stamps visible in patches where the dust hadn't yet claimed them. Claire crouched close, brushing away grime from one of the lids. The wax seal was deliberate, layered thickly as though meant to last centuries. She traced a faded stamp, though the design was too worn to identify. Her chest tightened. These were not the careless leftovers of a forgotten farm. They had been hidden, sealed, and walled away with intention. Lily leaned in, her pencil scratching furiously as she tried to capture the scene in her sketch pad. The cracked wall, the crates crouched in shadow, the lantern glow against their edges. "It's like they were waiting for us," she whispered. Claire didn't answer, but her mind swirled with questions. Why hide them? Why build a false wall instead of leaving them in plain sight? She imagined the Holbrooks, the family from photographs, carrying these crates down into the basement and sealing them away, their faces set with that same quiet defiance. Whatever was inside, it had been meant to endure, hidden from prying eyes until someone stumbled upon it. Noah brushed dust from his hands and looked at his mother. "We have to open one." His voice was steady but tinged with urgency, as though the idea of leaving them untouched was impossible. Claire hesitated, her eyes on the crates, the smell of wax and age filling her nose. She thought of the inspector's notice, the threat of demolition, the laughter of Richard at his family's gathering. The world believed this house had nothing left to give. Yet here, behind a false wall, were the first undeniable signs that the farmhouse still carried its secrets. She set the lantern down, its glow spilling across the chamber. "Not tonight," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "We'll come back when we're ready." Noah groaned in frustration, but he didn't argue. Lily only nodded, her pencil still moving across the page. Claire stood slowly, her hand brushing the rough edge of the wall one last time. Whatever lay inside those crates had been hidden for generations. It wasn't going anywhere now. They returned to the basement the following evening, lantern light swaying in Claire's hand as the three of them stepped cautiously down the stone stairs. The air was colder than before, thick with the scent of damp earth and old wood, and the silence carried a weight that made every step echo louder than it should. The false wall gaped open where they had pried the stones away, its edges jagged, revealing the crates waiting in the shadows. They stood in a neat row, stacked deliberately, as though someone had cared enough to arrange them for safekeeping. Noah moved first, dragging one of the smaller crates out into the light. His fingers dug into the grooves of the wood, leaving streaks through the dust. "This one," he said, breathing hard from the effort. Claire knelt beside him, brushing the grime from its lid. The wax seal along the edges had cracked in places, but still clung stubbornly to the wood. In its center was a faint impression of symbol, an eagle with outstretched wings, encircled by letters too faded to read. "Hold the lantern," Claire told Lily. Her daughter obeyed, steadying the glow while Claire searched the basement for something to pry the crate open. She found a rusted crowbar leaning against the wall and wedged it into the seam. The wood groaned, the wax snapping like brittle glass, and with a final heave, the lid splintered upward. Inside, straw packing spilled out, yellowed and dry with age. Claire reached in cautiously, her hand brushing against cold metal. She pulled free the first object, a rifle, its wood stock dark with time but intact, the barrel gleaming faintly under the lantern's glow. Noah's eyes widened as she laid it carefully on the dirt floor. Beneath it were more weapons, revolvers wrapped in cloth, bayonets bundled together, ammunition tins sealed tight. Each piece had been preserved as though waiting for a war that never came. "What is all this?" Noah whispered, all breaking through his voice. Claire didn't answer. She pulled aside more straw and uncovered a stack of documents bound in twine. The paper was brittle, edges browned, but the ink was still visible. Lists of names, tallies of supplies, notations of movements written in a careful hand. Among them lay ledgers similar to the one they had found in the pantry wall, but these bore seals stamped in red wax. The symbols clearer now, circles interlocked with triangles, each marked deliberate, each page suggesting an order larger than a simple farm. Lily crouched closer, tilting her head as she studied the seals. "It's the same kind of writing as before," she said. She pointed at the strange diagrams inked in the margins, repeating patterns of spirals and arrows. "It means something." Claire lifted one ledger gently, its leather cover flaking in her hands. She turned a page, her eyes narrowing as she recognized the same coded symbols woven between crop tallies and inventory. But this book was not about wheat or corn. The entries spoke of shipments, chests relocated, valuables dispersed to certain properties. Names of towns appeared in neat columns, each marked with a symbol that could not be mistaken for coincidence. "These aren't just records," Claire murmured. Their instructions. The lantern flame flickered, shadows shifting across the walls, as if the basement itself had leaned closer to listen. She felt the weight of history pressing against her, heavier than the rifles, heavier than the wood of the crates. Someone had hidden these things deliberately, sealed them away with the expectation that they would matter again one day. Noah picked up a revolver carefully, his fingers tracing the engraving on its handle. "These belong to soldiers," he said quietly, though it was more question than a statement. Claire thought of the date stamped faintly on one of the documents, 1864, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Lily touched the edge of one ledger with reverence. "Do you think the Holbrooks knew? The family in the pictures?" Claire closed the book gently, her eyes drifting to the crates still waiting in the shadows. "I think they were part of it," she said. "And I think this house was more than a home." They sat in silence, the lantern's glow illuminating weapons of forgotten war and pages heavy with secrets. The farmhouse had been mocked as worthless, a ruin for rats, but here in its depths lay proof of something larger, something hidden through generations. Claire felt her children watching her, waiting for her to name what it meant, but she had no answers yet, only the certainty that the house had given them its first true revelation, and that it was only the beginning. The morning after they uncovered the crates, Claire found herself staring out across the fields, the mist rising low and heavy over the tangled grass. She hadn't slept much. The images from the night before, the rifles, the brittle documents, the ledgers marked with strange seals, ran through her mind in endless circles. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the Holbrooks' photographs again, their eyes steady and unyielding, as though they had known she would one day hold their secrets in her hands. The silence of the farm was broken only by the low hum of insects and the distant creak of a tractor from across the valley. It was near midday when a figure appeared at the end of the drive. An older man walked slowly toward the gate, his steps deliberate, a straw hat shielding his face from the autumn sun. Claire recognized him vaguely, one of the farmers who lived on the ridge beyond the property. She had seen him once or twice in town, but had never spoken to him directly. He leaned against the gate when he reached it, resting both hands on the worn wood, and waited until she came closer. "You're the Whitmore woman," he said in a voice rasped with age. "Took over the Holbrook place." Claire nodded cautiously. "That's right. I'm Claire." The man studied her with pale eyes that seemed to measure more than they revealed. "I'm George Hensley. Been farming here most my life. My father knew this place well, back when the Holbrooks still worked it." Claire hesitated, uncertain how much to say. The crates, the weapons, the ledgers, those were things she wasn't ready to share. But George seemed to sense something already. He glanced past her at the farmhouse, at the sagging porch and boarded windows, and shook his head slowly. "Funny thing about that house," he said. "Folks around here used to whisper about it. Said the Holbrooks weren't just farmers. Said they were part of something bigger." He lowered his voice, though no one else was near. "A brotherhood, they called it. Men who made it their duty to keep things safe when the country was in chaos. Valuables, records, sometimes even people." Claire's pulse quickened, though she kept her face still. "A brotherhood?" she repeated. George nodded. "Not the kind that put their names in the paper. Secretive. My father told me once that during the war, when banks failed and towns burned, the Holbrook farm was a place where things were hidden, where something worth keeping could be tucked away until it was needed again. Folks said there were caches buried in these hills, stockpiles sealed up tight, waiting for a day when they might matter again." His eyes met hers, steady and serious. "Most called it foolish gossip. But my father swore he saw wagons come here at night, men carrying crates into the barn. He said the Holbrooks never let anyone inside the house after dark. And when they died out, the place was left to rot. But the rumors never stopped. Some said the Brotherhood still watched, even if no one knew who they were anymore." Claire felt the weight of the key in her pocket. The memory of the hollow echo under the trapdoor, the ledgers with their coded symbols. She realized then that the old farmer's warning was not just idle talk. He was telling her that what she had found was part of a story larger than her own misfortune. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. George straightened, his hands tightening on the gate. "Because I've lived long enough to know when the past stirs. It doesn't always stay quiet. You found this house for a reason, Mrs. Whitmore. But be careful. Whatever the Holbrooks guarded, they didn't mean for it to be easy. With that, he tipped his hat and began the slow walk back down the drive, his figure fading into the haze of the afternoon. Claire stood at the gate long after he was gone, her thoughts tangled with his words. The farmhouse had been mocked as worthless, a curse left in her hands. But George's warning made it clear. The house was never empty. It had been chosen as a keeper of things others wanted forgotten, and by stepping inside, she had become part of its watch. The farmhouse fireplace had not been used in decades. Its stone hearth was blackened with soot, and the iron grate sat crooked, one hinge rusted through. Claire had avoided it at first, too focused on clearing rooms and patching leaks. But on that evening, when the air grew colder and the wind whistled through broken windows, she found herself drawn to it. She wanted to clear the ash, to see if the chimney might ever be made functional again. With a metal poker she found leaning in the corner, she began stirring the thick, powdery layer that had settled inside. Dust rose in thin gray clouds, carrying the faint smell of smoke that lingered even after all these years. Noah crouched beside her, his hood pulled low, watching with disinterest until the poker scraped against something solid. It wasn't stone or charred wood. It gave slightly, as though she had struck stiff paper. She knelt lower, brushing the ash away with her hands until a fragment of parchment appeared. Its edges curled and blackened, the surface blistered from fire. She lifted it carefully, half expecting it to crumble, but it held together, fragile but intact. Lily hurried over, her eyes wide. "What is it?" she asked, already clutching her sketch pad to her chest as if preparing to capture the discovery. Claire spread the parchment slowly across the hearthstone, brushing away ash with gentle strokes. The surface was scorched, entire corners burned through, but what remained was unmistakable. A map. Faded ink lines ran across the page, branching and weaving in patterns too deliberate to be random. She traced one with her finger, following its curve until it ended in a circle marked with a small cross. Noah leaned closer, his skepticism melting into fascination. "Those are tunnels," he said, his voice low. "Look, those lines go into the house." He pointed to a square drawn at the center, its shape matching the outline of the farmhouse itself. From it stretched multiple passages, leading out beneath the land in every direction. Some ended abruptly. Others branched further, connecting to other squares and circles Claire didn't yet understand. Lily studied it carefully, her finger hovering over one of the marks near the edge. "This one's by the well," she said. "See? The circle is right where the yard is." She flipped open her sketch pad and began copying the map, her pencil moving quickly as if afraid the parchment might disintegrate before she finished. Claire sat back on her heels, her mind racing. The crates, the ledgers, the weapons, all of it pointed to something larger than just a hidden chamber. This map confirmed it. The Holbrooks hadn't simply used the basement as storage. They had carved out an entire network beneath the farm, tunnels that stretched beyond the boundaries of the house, their purposes sealed away in ash until now. She wondered who had tried to burn the map, and why it had been left in the fireplace, charred but not destroyed. Was it meant to be hidden, or had someone planned to return for it and never did? The thought unsettled her, a reminder that whatever secrets this land held, they had once been dangerous enough to conceal in fire. Noah clenched his fists, excitement flashing in his eyes. "We have to find where these tunnels go," he said. "If there are more crates, if there's more whatever they were hiding, this map shows us how to get there." Claire folded the parchment gently, though its edges crackled with fragility. "We'll move carefully," she said. "This isn't just ours to rush into. Someone made these tunnels for a reason, and we need to understand why before we start digging through them." Lily looked up from her sketch, her pencil smudged with ash. "Maybe the Brotherhood Mr. Hensley talked about built them," she said softly. "Maybe they want to keep everything safe, no matter what happened above." Claire didn't answer, but the idea settled into her mind with the weight of truth. The farmhouse had been called worthless, mocked as a burden, yet here it stood on top of something deeper, literally and figuratively. As the lantern light flickered against the blackened hearth, she held the map in her hands and realized that they had uncovered not just a house's forgotten past, but the outline of an entire network. The farmhouse was no ruin. It was a gateway, and now that gateway had begun to open. The knock came just after noon, sharp and purposeful, echoing to the quiet farmhouse. Claire had been at the kitchen table with the map spread out carefully before her, its scorched edges weighted with jars to keep it from curling. Noah was pacing, impatient to follow the tunnels of parchment hinted at, while Lily bent over her sketch pad, copying each fragile line with care. The knock startled all three of them. No one ever came here uninvited. Claire stood and moved the door, wiping ash from her hands onto her jeans. When she opened it, a woman in a tailored gray coat stood waiting. She was elegant in the kind of way that didn't fit the sagging porch or the weed-choked yard. Her blonde hair pulled neatly back, a leather folder tucked under her arm. She smiled as though she had rehearsed it, her eyes flicking past Claire into the shadowy interior of the house. "Mrs. Whitmore?" the woman asked, her tone smooth and assured. "I'm Evelyn Shaw with Shaw and Associates. I'm here about your property." Claire tightened her grip on the doorframe. "What about it?" Evelyn's smile widened, professional but practiced. "I represent a group of interested developers. They've had their eye on this parcel of land for some time. Now that it's back in use, they asked me to come speak with you directly." She opened her folder, sliding a sheet forward. "They're prepared to make you a cash offer. Today." Claire took the paper, but didn't glance at it immediately. She studied the woman instead. The crisp lines on her coat, the polished boots that had never touched the muddy yard before now, the way her gaze lingered not on the peeling clapboards but toward the house itself, as though she knew more than she was letting on. Finally, Claire looked down at the offer, her breath catching when she saw the number. It was far higher than anything she'd expected, more than the property's supposed worth, more even than what Richard had argued during the divorce. Enough to buy a new house outright, enough to silence the whispers of family, who said she had been left with nothing. "Why?" Claire asked quietly, lifting her eyes back to Evelyn. "This house is condemned. The county inspector was here not a week ago. He said it wasn't worth saving." Evelyn tilted her head, the smile never leaving her lips. "Developers see potential where others see ruin. It's a large tract of land, excellent for redevelopment. These things move quickly, Mrs. Whitmore. I'd advise you to take advantage before the offer is withdrawn." Noah had appeared behind his mother, his arms crossed, suspicion etched across his face. "What do they want with this place?" he demanded. Evelyn's gaze flicked to him briefly before it turned to Claire, ignoring the question. Claire folded the paper and handed it back without looking again at the number. "I'm not selling," she said, her voice steady. Evelyn's smile faltered, though only for a fraction of a second. "I think you should reconsider. Cash in hand now is better than years of struggle in a place that can't be lived in. You have children, Mrs. Whitmore. You owe them stability." Claire's jaw tightened. She thought of the crates sealed with wax, the rifles hidden for generations, the ledger that recorded secrets in coded symbols. She thought of the scorched map, the tunnels beneath her feet, and the Holbrook faces staring out from photographs with unflinching resolve. This farmhouse was more than land. It was a trust, whether she had asked for it or not. She met Evelyn's gaze directly. "We're not selling." The agent studied her for a long moment, her expression smoothing back into polite neutrality. Then she slipped the paper into her folder, closed it with a snap, and offered a final nod. "Very well, but offers like this don't last forever. I'll leave you my card, in case you change your mind." She placed the card on the railing and turned, her heels clicking sharply against the porch before crunching into the gravel drive. Claire watched until the car disappeared beyond the curve of the road, a trail of dust rising in its wake. When she turned back, Noah was scowling. "She knows about the house," he said. "About what's here?" Claire picked up the card and slipped it into her pocket without answering. The farmhouse creaked softly around them, the silence returning heavier than before. The offer had been generous, far too generous for a ruin the county had already condemned. It wasn't the land they wanted. It was what lay beneath. The following weekend, Claire agreed to attend a family dinner at her sister Denise's house, though she knew before she walked that the evening would not be about food or company. Denise lived in a tidy two-story on the edge of town, every detail curated to appear better than it was. Candles burning on the table, polished photographs lined neatly along the walls, the scent of roast chicken filling the rooms. Claire had brought Noah and Lily because Denise insisted, saying family needed to stick together. But the moment they arrived, Claire felt the undertow of something more deliberate waiting for her. They sat around the long dining table, 10 of them in all, the hum of conversation carefully choreographed. Denise's husband poured wine, her daughters passed dishes, but Claire could feel the glances passing between her relatives, the weight of words waiting for the right moment. It came before the plates were even cleared. "Claire," Denise began, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, "I heard someone came by with an offer on the farmhouse." She didn't ask, she stated it. The room fell quiet, and all attention shifted toward her. Claire set down her fork carefully. "Yes, a real estate agent." And Denise pressed. "I said no." The silence stretched for a moment before breaking with a chorus of disbelief. One of her cousins leaned forward, shaking his head. "Claire, you can't be serious. That place isn't fit for a family. You've got 2 kids to think about, and you turned down real money?" Denise's husband chimed in, his voice heavy with judgment. "I work with developers all the time. If they're offering cash for that ruin, you take it. That's not just an opportunity, it's an escape." Noah shifted uncomfortably beside his mother, glaring at the table. Lily held her sketch pad in her lap, doodling in the margins but listening to every word. Claire breathed slowly, steadying herself. "It's not that simple," she said. But the words opened the floodgate. Patricia, Richard's mother, who had somehow invited herself to the dinner, leaned in with the same look of disdain she had worn in the courtroom. "Of course it's simple. You take the money, move into something safe, and stop dragging those children through your stubborn pride. That farmhouse is a shell, Claire. You're clinging to it like it means something when it doesn't." Claire's jaw tightened, but before she could speak, Denise took her hand in a gesture meant to seem compassionate. "We just don't want to see you waste more years chasing ghosts." Richards moved on. "You should too. Think of Noah and Lily. Don't they deserve a real home instead of crumbling walls and broken floors?" The words struck her harder than she expected. She looked at her children, Noah silent but tense, Lily sketching the faint outline of a crate she had seen in the basement, and she realized they had already chosen what this house meant to them. It wasn't just rotten ruin. It was mystery history, something worth uncovering. "I know what I'm doing," Claire said firmly, her voice low but unshaken. Patricia scoffed, pushing back her chair. "You've always been too proud to admit when you're wrong." Denise sighed, exasperated, as if her patience were fraying. "Just promise me you'll think about it, Claire. You can't drag those children down with you. Sometimes survival means letting go." Claire rose from the table, her hand steady even as her heart pounded. She gathered her coat, motioned for her children, and without another word walked them out into the crisp night. The air outside was cooler, freer, the stars spread wide above the town. Noah broke the silence first. "They don't get it," he said bitterly. Lily slipped her hand into her mother's, whispering, "We don't need them to." Claire tightened her grip on her daughter's hand as they walked toward the car. Inside her chest, a fire had kindled, small but steady. Her family wanted her to sell, to abandon the farmhouse for stability. But stability was a mask, and the farmhouse was truth. The secrets it carried were theirs now, and no offer, no laughter, no lecture at a polished dinner table would make her surrender them. The farmhouse seemed restless in the days after the family dinner, its silence pressing harder, the creaks in its bones sharper, as though it too had heard the voices urging Claire to abandon it. She ignored the echoes of her relatives and turned her attention back to what the house itself revealed. The scorched map lay open on the kitchen table, its lines traced again and again until she knew them by heart. Noah hovered over it constantly, his eyes drawn to the branching marks beneath the farmhouse, certain that what they had already found was only the beginning. It was Noah who insisted they return to the basement after dark, lantern in hand. Lily had fallen asleep curled against the couch with her sketch pad across her chest, but Noah's urgency wouldn't let him rest. Claire followed him down the narrow stone stairs, the chill wrapping around them as though the house had been waiting. The air smelled of damp earth and rust. each step stirring the scent deeper. The crates behind the false wall remained where they had left them, shadows looming in the flickering lantern light. But Noah wasn't interested in opening another. His gaze swept the basement walls, tracing his hand along the stones as though listening for what lay behind. "The map showed more than this," he said. "There's another passage." Claire lifted the lantern higher, casting light across the far end of the chamber. That was when she noticed it. A bricked archway half concealed by shells and debris, its curve faintly visible beneath the weight of years. The bricks were not the same as the others that lined the basement. They were newer, smoother, as if placed later to seal something off. Together, they dragged the shells aside, jars clattering and breaking against the floor. Dust rose in thick clouds, stinging their eyes, but when it cleared, the arch stood fully exposed. Its edges had been mortared deliberately, every seam pressed firm, meant to discourage curious hands. Noah stepped forward, pressing his ear against the bricks. "It's hollow," he whispered, his voice taut with excitement. Claire retrieved the old chisel they had used before and handed it to him. For a moment she hesitated, her hand on his shoulder. "Careful," she murmured, though her own pulse raced with anticipation. He nodded and began to work at the mortar, the scrape of metal against stone echoing in the chamber. Slowly, piece by piece, the bricks loosened. Claire joined him, her hand steady, prying until the first brick clattered to the ground. Behind it was only darkness. They worked in silence, sweat streaking through the dust on their faces, until the opening was wide enough for them to slip through. Claire raised a lantern and leaned inside. Beyond the arch stretched a cavern, larger than the basement itself, its ceiling arch-high and lined with rough stone. The lantern's glow caught on shapes stacked deep into the shadows. Rows of crates, dozens of them, preserved as if untouched by time. Noah's breath caught. "There's so many." They stepped inside, their footsteps muffled by the dirt floor. The cavern smelled faintly of wax and wood, the air cooler, heavier. Claire lifted the lantern higher, the light glancing off red wax seals still intact, the same strange symbols stamped into their lids. Some were stacked nearly to the ceiling, while others lined the walls in neat rows. It was a hidden vault, concealed by the Holbrooks or those before them, meant to outlast the storms of history. Claire felt her throat tighten as she realized the scale of what they had uncovered. The farmhouse was not simply the hiding place of a few forgotten crates. It was a gateway to a network of preservation, a treasury of secrets waiting beneath the earth. She thought of Evelyn Shaw's offer, of her family's insistence to sell, and understood why strangers had come knocking with money in hand. They had known, or at least suspected, what lay hidden here. Noah turned to her, his face lit by the lantern's glow, his eyes burning with certainty. "This is why we're here," he said. His voice trembled, not with fear but with awe. "This is what they didn't want us to find." Claire nodded slowly, the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. She tightened her grip on the lantern, the crates stretching into shadow before them, and knew they had crossed a threshold. The farmhouse was no longer just a ruin left to her in a divorce. It was a keeper of legacies, and it had chosen not to remain silent any longer. It was 2 days after their discovery of the cavern when Claire heard the crunch of tires in the gravel drive. She had not been expecting anyone. Evelyn Shaw's business card still sat on the kitchen counter, but Claire hadn't called her, and Denise had stopped trying to press her into selling after their tense dinner. She stepped out onto the sagging porch, wiping her hands on a rag, and saw a pale blue sedan pulling to a stop by the rusted gate. A tall man climbed out, his frame lean, his posture deliberate, a leather satchel slung across his shoulder. His tweed coat, worn at the elbows, made him look more suited to a lecture hall than the mud of a Vermont farm. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he called, his voice careful but firm. "Yes," Claire answered warily, keeping her children inside. "Can I help you?" The man approached the porch, removing his hat. His eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the farmhouse with interest rather than disdain. "My name is Dr. Elias Porter. I teach history at Dartmouth. I heard rumors, well, whispers, really, that the Holbrook property has been disturbed, that something unusual has been found." He paused, watching her face, his words respectful but probing. "I wanted to see for myself." Claire stiffened. "Rumors travel fast for a ruin no one cares about." "Ruins," Porter replied, adjusting his glasses, "have a way of holding more than dust. And this one, in particular, has long been a subject of speculation among historians." He lowered his voice slightly. "I believe the Holbrooks were tied to a network known as the Preservation Brotherhood. The symbols you may have seen, spirals, interlocking circles, triangular seals, those are not random. They're marks of an old and secretive consortium." Claire said nothing at first. The name struck her like a chord. Brotherhood. The same word George Hensley, the old farmer, had whispered at the gate. She studied Porter carefully, searching for deception, but his expression was earnest, almost reverent. At last, she stepped aside. "Come in." Inside, she led him to the dining room where the scorched map still lay weighted on the table. Noah and Lily appeared in the doorway, curious but cautious, watching as the stranger leaned over the parchment with growing intensity. His eyes widened. "Remarkable," he murmured, tracing the lines with his finger. "I've seen sketches in archives, references in journals from the late 19th century, but nothing this complete. This is the work of the Brotherhood." He explained as he studied. The Preservation Brotherhood had been a loose alliance of industrialists, landowners, and scholars who believed that America's cycles of upheaval, wars, economic collapse, political unrest, threatened to erase what they valued most. In response, they created hidden networks of caches, storing wealth, record, and artifacts in discrete locations. Each site bore their seals, coded to be recognized only by initiates. The Holbrook Farm, Porter believed, was one such site. Lily set her sketchpad on the table beside the map. "We found ledgers, too," she said, her voice hesitant. She opened to a page where she had copied the symbols. Porter adjusted his glasses again, studying her careful drawings. "Yes," he said softly, "these are Brotherhood marks. They meant this house to be a keeper, not just of family, but of history itself." Noah, still skeptical, leaned forward. "So what's in the crates? Why hide weapons and papers down there?" Porter's gaze flicked to him. Because preservation is not just about survival, it's about readiness. If society faltered, the Brotherhood believed their caches could restore order economically, even militarily. They were preparing for collapse, one they thought inevitable. Claire listened in silence, her thoughts caught between fear and awe. Everything she had found, every whisper in the walls, every hidden seal, suddenly had a name, a purpose. It was no longer just mystery. It was history, deliberate and guarded. She looked at Porter, measuring the careful hunger in his eyes. He was a man who wanted knowledge, but she wondered how far he would go to have it. At last she spoke. "You've seen the map. You've heard the stories. But what's down there, what we found, stays here for now. This is my family's burden now, whether I ask for it or not." Porter inclined his head, his expression respectful but tinged with disappointment. "I understand, but be cautious, Mrs. Whitmore. The Brotherhood did not vanish without reason. There are those who still remember what they left behind, and they may not be as welcoming as I am." The words lingered long after he left, his sedan disappearing into the autumn dusk. Claire stood at the window, the farmhouse creaking softly around her, and felt the truth settle heavier than ever. The ruins were not ruins. They were a vault, and now others knew it too. The following afternoon, Elias returned. Claire had half expected him to vanish after his first visit, the way curious strangers often did once they satisfied their need to peek into other people's lives. But when she saw his car rumbling down the gravel drive again, she understood that what he had seen here had anchored him. He stepped in the sedan with the same tweed coat, the same satchel slung over his shoulder, but this time his posture carried a different weight, an eagerness restrained only by the courtesy of a guest. Claire met him on the porch, her arms folded. "You said enough the other day to make me wonder what you're really after," she said flatly. "So tell me why you came back." Elias adjusted his glasses, looking at her with a calmness that didn't feel rehearsed. "Because this farmhouse," he said quietly, "was never just a home. It was a node in a network, one of several sites scattered across the Northeast. perhaps even beyond. I've studied references to them for years. The Brotherhood did not trust banks or governments to safeguard the things they believed essential for survival. They trusted their own. Reluctantly, Claire stepped aside and let him in. Noah was at the table, poring over the scorch map again, and Lily sat with her sketch pad, shading in her careful copy of the cabin they had found. They looked up warily as Elias entered, but Claire nodded to them, signaling there was no danger here, at least for now. Elias laid his satchel on the table and pulled out several folders, their edges worn from years of use. Inside were copies of letters, fragments of journals, faded diagrams. He spread them out beside the map, his finger tapping the paper. "You see here," he said, pointing to a passage in an old letter, a reference to the keepers of the vaults. It mentions properties in Vermont, New Hampshire, and upstate New York, all described in vague terms. Farms, mills, estates, ordinary on the surface. But beneath them, something else. The Holbrook farm matches every detail I pieced together. Noah leaned forward, skeptical but curious. "So they had stuff all over? Like treasure?" "Not treasure in the usual sense," Elias replied. "Though some vaults did contain wealth, gold, bonds, currency. Others held records, genealogies, even books they feared might be censored or destroyed. And yes, weapons. They believed crises would come in cycles. Financial collapse, war, famine. Each time, society would weaken. They built these sites to safeguard what they believed could rebuild it." Lily glanced up from her drawing, her voice soft. "Like seeds," she said, "keeping them safe until you can plant them again." Elias smiled faintly at her words. "Exactly. Seeds of survival. And this farmhouse was one of their gardens." Claire felt a chill as she listened. She thought of the laughter at the dinner table, Richard's mock toast, Evelyn Shaw's generous offer. Everyone had seen the farmhouse as a curse. Yet standing here with the map and the crates below their feet, she realized it was the opposite. It was inheritance of another kind, a trust placed in hands that did not yet understand it. Elias gathered the documents, his expression tightening. "But you must understand," he said, "if this site has remained hidden until now, it was because secrecy was survival. The Brotherhood didn't advertise their caches. They chose families they trusted, wove them into the fabric of their work. The Holbrooks may have died out, but their charge didn't. When you inherited this house, you inherited their burden. Others will come for it. Some already have." Claire thought of Evelyn's cold smile, of the way she had pressed the offer into her hands, speaking as though she knew more than she admitted. She thought of George Hensley's warning at the gate, of the old man's words about wagons arriving at night. Piece by piece, the puzzle was no longer random. It was a story stretching across generations, and now it had reached her. She closed the map carefully, folding its fragile edges as though it might crumble if mishandled. "If this house is part of something bigger," she said, "then walking away isn't an option." Elias studied her for a moment, then nodded gravely. "No, Mrs. Whitmore, it isn't." The first letter came folded neatly in an unmarked envelope, slipped into the crack of the farmhouse door sometime before dawn. Claire found it when she stepped outside to fetch water from the old pump. The envelope was cream-colored, heavier than ordinary paper, with no stamp, no return address, no handwriting on the front. Only her name, *Claire Whitmore*, typed in small block letters, the kind that carried no trace of the person who pressed keys. She brought it inside, her fingers cold against the paper, and laid it on the table. Noah was already awake, pacing near the window, while Lily sat cross-legged with her sketch pad, drawing the outline of the arched cavern they had found. Claire opened the envelope slowly, her breath catching as she unfolded the single sheet inside. *Leave this house. It is not yours to keep. Vacate before it is too late. *. The words were typed the same way as her name, neat, mechanical, stripped of identity. Beneath them was nothing, not even a signature, only the emptiness of a warning meant to be taken without question. Noah read over her shoulder, his jaw tightening. "Who sent that?" Claire shook her head. "Someone who wants us gone." By nightfall, a second envelope arrived, this time slipped beneath the window in the parlor. It carried the same paper, The same stereotype. Do not force our hand. Claire burned in the fireplace, the ashes curling into smoke that drifted up the clogged chimney. But the unease lingered, settling into the house with the dusk. 2 nights later, Noah shook her awake in the dark. "Mom," he whispered urgently, "there's a car." She followed him to the window, her bare feet cold against the warped floorboards. Outside, beyond the sagging fence, headlights glowed faintly. A vehicle idled on the road, its engine a low hum against the night. It sat there for nearly half an hour, unmoving, before the lights snapped off and the sound faded into silence. It happened again the next evening. Different vehicle, same stillness. Some nights there were 2, parked at opposite ends of the drive, as if watching. Once, Lily swore she saw a figure step out, standing briefly near the gate before vanishing back into the dark. Claire began locking the doors with makeshift bolts, though she knew the rotted would never keep anyone determined out. The children felt the weight of it too. Noah's restlessness sharpened into anger. He kept the crowbar close at hand, muttering that if anyone tried to come inside, he'd be ready. Lily grew quieter, her sketches shifting from careful drawings of crates and symbols to dark lines that filled entire pages, shadows pressing at the edges of her paper. Claire tried to keep her voice steady, to tell them the house had weathered storms before and would weather this too. But inside, her chest tightened with each night the headlights returned, with each anonymous letter that appeared at the door. Whoever they were, they knew about the farmhouse, knew about its role in the Brotherhood's network, and they were not content to let her uncover it in peace. One morning, she found a 3rd letter pinned to the wooden gate with a nail. The words were shorter this time, more direct. "Last chance." The paper flapped in the breeze as though mocking her resolve. She pulled it free and crumpled in her fist, her eyes drawn to the fields beyond. The farmhouse creaked behind her, as if an answer, its timbers groaning like an old animal rising to its feet. Claire knew then that the secrets buried here were no longer quiet. They had stirred, and in stirring, they had drawn eyes from beyond the valley. Whoever circled the house at night, whoever typed those letters, believed the farmhouse still belonged to them. But as she turned back toward the door, her children waiting inside, she understood that walking away was no longer an option. The house had chosen them now, and she would not give it up. The basement had become both a place of fear and necessity. Each time Claire descended the stone steps with the lantern swinging in her hand, the memory of the anonymous letters pressed harder against her chest. The threats, the strange vehicles on the road at night, all of it made the crates and ledgers below feel less like discoveries and more like dangerous burdens. Yet she kept returning, because the house demanded it, and because some part of her knew that whatever secrets the Holbrooks had left behind were meant to surface through her. It was while clearing debris near the shelves that she found the 2nd ledger. The dirt was damp in that corner, the stone walls sweating with moisture, and some of the old planks had softened and warped. Claire shifted one aside, and there, wedged between a broken crate and the wall, was a book wrapped in cloth. The fabric was stiff with age, brittle in her hands, but the leather beneath was surprisingly intact. She carried it into the open space, brushing off soil before setting it on an overturned crate. Noah and Lily crowded close, their eyes fixed on the object as though it might open on its own. The cover bore no name, no seal, only faint indentations that might once have been gilding, long since worn away. But across the front, scrawled in ink that had bled and faded but not disappeared, were 4 words, "For those who endure." Claire ran her fingers across the letters, the roughness of the ink catching against her skin. Lily whispered the words aloud, her voice soft, reverent. Noah only muttered, "What does that even mean?" Claire opened the cover carefully. The smell of earth and mildew rose immediately, but the pages held, their binding surprisingly strong. Inside, columns of numbers stretched neatly across the paper, at first glance resembling the farm tallies she had seen in the earlier ledger. Bushels of corn, gallons of cider, quantities of livestock. But woven between them were the coded markings again, spirals, triangles, interlocked circles, and arrows. These were denser than in the first ledger, more deliberate, as if the writer had shifted from margin notes to full entries of their own. One page listed 30 barrels with a spiral drawn beside it, then 12 rifles with a triangle enclosing a dot. Another contained place names she recognized from the scorched map: Montpelier, Keene, Brattleboro, each paired with numbers and symbols. Some entries were underlined twice in thick ink, their urgency obvious even to untrained eyes. Noah leaned closer, tracing a column with his finger. This isn't farming. This is logistics, like inventory for something bigger. Claire nodded slowly. It's a record, she said, but written so only those who understood the code could read it. Lily's pencil was already moving, copying the markings into her sketch pad. Her drawings had become more than habit. They were becoming an archive of their own. She paused to glance up. Maybe it's instructions, she suggested, for people like us, the ones who were supposed to find it. Claire closed the ledger gently, her fingers lingering on the words across the cover. For those who endure. It felt less like a title and more like a message, a reminder meant to reach across the years. Whoever had written it had known hardship, had expected collapse, and had left behind these records not just for preservation, but for survival. Above them, the farmhouse creaked, the wind pressing against its frail bones. Claire looked at her children, their faces lit by the lantern glow, and felt the truth settle deep in her chest. The ledgers, the crates, the map, they were more than remnants. They were a charge, passed forward to those stubborn enough to endure when others faltered. She tied the cloth back around the ledger and tucked it under her arm. This was not something to leave lying in the dirt. Whatever dangers circled the farmhouse now, she understood with new clarity that the house was giving her tools to face them. The Holbrooks had endured. Now it was her turn. The basement had grown familiar. Yet each time Claire descended with the lantern, her pulse quickened as though she were entering unknown ground. The house always seemed to exhale when they lifted the trapdoor, the cool breath of earth rising to meet them, carrying that faint metallic tang of soil and iron. On this night, Noah led the way, crowbar in hand, his determination outpacing his fear. The second ledger still sat on the kitchen table upstairs, its cryptic entries burning in their minds, hinting at supplies and wealth hidden not just for survival, but for something larger. Claire knew they had to search deeper. They returned to the far end of the cavern where the crates stood stacked like silent sentinels. Beyond them, the stone walls stretched smooth and unbroken, except for one narrow seam running vertically from floor to ceiling. Noah had found it earlier, pressing his hand along the stone until he noticed a faint shift in sound, hollow instead of solid. He had been insistent ever since. Tonight, they carried the lantern closer and set to work. The mortar gave way reluctantly, the chisel slipping between the seams, flakes of stone dust falling into the dirt. Each strike of the crowbar echoed through the cavern, bouncing off the low ceiling like a warning drum. Claire braced her weight against one of the stones, feeling it shift under her palms before tumbling free. Behind it, darkness waited. Noah grinned through sweat and dust, his eyes bright. "There's space back there," he said. Together they widened the gap, stone by stone, until the opening revealed a passage barely wide enough to crawl through. Claire lifted the lantern and leaned forward. The light spilled into a chamber beyond, larger than the one they stood in. The air that rushed out was colder, drier, preserved by its own isolation. They squeezed through carefully, the lantern held high, and stepped into a room unlike any they had seen. It was lined with wooden chests, their edges reinforced with iron, their lids sealed with layers of wax and stamped with the faint impressions of Brotherhood symbols. Dust lay thick across them, but the seals were intact, the iron still strong. In the lantern glow, the wax gleamed faintly red, as though it had only just been pressed. Claire knelt before the nearest chest, brushing her hand across its surface. The wood was firm, astonishingly well preserved. She reached for the crowbar, hesitated, then pressed it against the seam. With a sharp crack, the wax broke. Noah steadied the lantern as she pried the lid upward. The hinges creaked, then gave way, revealing straw packing inside. She brushed it aside and froze. Gold coins glinted back at her, stacked neatly in small cloth sacks, the kind bankers once used. Their shine was muted but unmistakable, the weight of centuries carried in their metallic gleam. Beneath them lay bundles of paper wrapped in oilcloth. Claire lifted one, her hands trembling as she unrolled the bundle. Inside were stock certificates, Early issues from companies she recognized only vaguely from history books, railroads, and industrial ventures that had shaped the country's foundation. Some bore dates from the 1860s, others from the turn of the century, each one marked with elaborate seals. Noah leaned in, his eyes wide. That's money. Real money. Claire shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. It's more than that. It's wealth preserved. Value carried forward for a future they thought might need it. They opened another chest, and another. Inside one, stacks of government bonds, brittle but protected, their ink still legible. In another, ledgers marked with coded entries, similar to the one upstairs, but filled with numbers too vast to be farm tallies. Some chests contained more coins, silver mixed with gold, each sack tied and sealed. Lily had followed them quietly, her sketch pad clutched to her chest. Now she set it down and drew in quick strokes, capturing the glow of the lantern over the open chest, the coins spilling from their bags. Her mother's face bent close in wonder. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "They saved it all. For us." Claire touched her daughter's shoulder, her own breath uneven. "Not for us," she said softly. "For whoever came after. For those who endured." She thought of the words on the second ledger, of the Holbrooks and their photographs, of the warnings that had begun to arrive. These treasures had not been forgotten by chance. They had been guarded. And now, by uncovering them, she and her children had stepped fully into that role. The farmhouse above groaned in the wind, its timbers rattling as though acknowledging their discovery. Claire closed the lid gently, sealing the wealth inside once more. She knew the Brotherhood had not built this for display. They had built it for survival, for the day when what was hidden would matter again. And now, with strangers circling the farm and threats slipping beneath her door, she understood that day might have come. The knock on the farmhouse door was different this time, louder, sharper, insistent. Claire had been in the kitchen with the ledger open before her, the smell of damp earth still clinging to her clothes from another night in the basement. Noah glanced up from the window where he had been keeping a quiet watch on the road, and Lily froze in the middle of sketching, her pencil hovering above the page. The knock came again before Claire even reached the door. When she opened it, Evelyn Shaw stood on the porch, her coat buttoned against the autumn wind, flanked by two men in dark suits carrying leather cases. Their presence carried none of the practiced charm from her first visit. This was no longer about persuasion. Evelyn's smile was tight, her eyes sharp, her voice clipped. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, stepping forward without waiting to be invited. "We need to talk." Claire held her ground, her hand on the edge of the door. "You've made your offer. I gave you my answer. This isn't about an offer anymore." Evelyn's tone hardened as she gestured to the men behind her. "These are legal representatives of my clients. We reviewed the property records, and there are technicalities that place the ownership of this land in dispute. I strongly advise you to cooperate before this becomes far more unpleasant for you." Claire let the silence stretch, the weight of her children's eyes pressing from behind. She finally stepped back, motioning them inside. The suits crossed the threshold, their polished shoes tapping against the warped floorboards. Evelyn walked with the air of someone already victorious, setting her folder down on the dining room table, without regard for the dust or the fragile map still spread across its surface. "You see," she continued, flipping open her documents, "the Holbrook estate was tied up in debt at the time it passed hands decades ago. Certain claims were never properly cleared. My clients have acquired those claims. That means, in effect, that this property is not fully yours to occupy. By law, you may be considered trespassing." Claire felt her jaw tighten. "You think waving papers in my face will scare me into leaving?" Evelyn leaned forward, her voice dropping. "I think you know as well as I do that this house holds more than rotting wood. And I think you understand why others are interested in it." Her eyes flicked toward the rug covering the trapdoor, then back to Claire. "You've already found something, haven't you?" Noah stiffened, fists clenched at his sides. Lily pressed closer to her mother, her sketchpad held protectively against her chest. Claire moved to stand between her children and the intruders, her voice steady but edged. "What's under this house is none of your business. My children and I live here. That's the end of it. One of the lawyers cleared his throat, sliding a paper across the table. "We're prepared to initiate proceedings immediately if you refuse to vacate. Fines, court orders, eventual seizure of property. Mrs. Whitmore, you don't want this fight." Claire stared at the page but did not touch it. The words blurred in her vision, not from confusion but from fury. She thought of the crates, of the second ledger marked for those who endure, of the gold coins and certificates sealed away for generations. She thought of the Holbrook's eyes in the photographs, unyielding, defiant. Slowly, she raised her gaze to Evelyn. "You're not the first person to try to strip this house of its worth," she said. "But you won't be the last either. I won't sell. I won't move. And I won't be bullied." The air in the room thickened, the lantern on the table flickering as though stirred by an unseen draft. Evelyn's composure cracked for the briefest second, her lips tightening, before she gathered her papers and snapped the folder shut. "Then we'll see you in court," she said coldly. "And when that day comes, you'll wish you had taken an offer." She turned sharply, her heels striking against the boards as she left, the lawyers following in silence. The door slammed behind them, the farmhouse trembling as though it too had absorbed the confrontation. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind pressing against the shutters. Noah spoke first, his voice low but fierce. She knows about the crates." Claire drew her children close, her hand resting protectively on Lily's shoulder. "Let her come with all her papers," she said quietly. "This house was built to endure, and so are we." The farmhouse felt heavier after Evelyn's visit, the air charged with the threat she left behind. Claire carried the tension in her shoulders, though she tried to hide it from Noah and Lily. The words trespassing and seizure echoed like nails hammered into her chest. She knew Evelyn would return, and that next time it wouldn't just be with words. But 2 nights later, Elias Porter arrived again, his pale sedan crunching up the gravel with urgency in its engine. He stepped out carrying not just his satchel this time, but a locked tin case under his arm. His coat was dusted with road grit, his face drawn from long hours and little sleep. Claire met him on the porch with suspicion, but his expression softened when he saw her. "I've been in the archives," he said. "Cambridge, Concord, Dartmouth private holdings. I think I found what you need." Inside, they gathered around the dining room table. The children leaned close, Noah restless, Lily steady with her sketch pad as if preparing to record every detail. Elias set the case down carefully and opened it. Inside were folders of old paper, bound volumes with frayed edges, and one leather portfolio tied with faded ribbon. He untied it slowly, his hands reverent, and spread its contents before them. "These," he said, tapping the first pages, "are charters, written agreements drafted by the Brotherhood in the late 1800s. Each site of preservation was assigned not just a location, but to a custodian family. The Holbrooks were one such family." He slid a page toward Claire, the ink brown but legible. At the top was a Brotherhood seal, interlocking circles and the spiral mark she had come to know well. Beneath it, in formal script, was language naming the Holbrook estate as a custodial house of trust, bound not to ownership but stewardship. Claire's breath caught as her eyes traced the lines. "So it wasn't theirs to profit from," she murmured. "It was theirs to keep safe." Elias nodded. "Precisely. These weren't caches to be sold off. They were to be preserved through generations, passed down to heirs or those appointed to continue the duty. That's why they sealed the crates, why they coded the ledgers. And here," he pulled another document forward, more fragile than the first, its edges crumbling, "is the succession clause. If the Holbrook line failed, inheritance of the house would carry with it custodianship of the contents. Whoever holds the deed holds a charge." Noah leaned closer, his eyes fierce. "That means Mom. She's the one who got the deed in the divorce. That means it's hers." Lily's pencil scratched quickly across the page, copying the seal as if etching it into permanence. "For those who endure," she whispered, repeating the words from the second ledger. Claire felt the weight of Elias's words pressing against her heart. For months she had been told the house was worthless, mocked for clinging to ruin, pressured to sell, threatened with eviction. Now here lay proof. Proof that the farmhouse was not a curse but a trust, a responsibility chosen for her by history itself. She straightened, her hand steadying on the edge of the table. Elias met her gaze. If Evelyn Shaw takes you to court, this is your defense. She can argue value. She can argue decay. But she cannot argue stewardship. By their own founding documents, you are the rightful trustee of what lies beneath this house. Not for profit, not for greed, for preservation. The farmhouse creaked in the wind as if affirming his words. Claire closed her eyes briefly, remembering the eyes of the Holbrooks in the photographs. Stern, steady, defiant, they had endured so the vault would remain. And now it had passed to her. When she opened her eyes, her voice was calm, stronger than she expected. "Then let them come," she said. "I won't give this up. This house was built to endure, and so was I." The county courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper, its wood-paneled walls echoing with a low murmur of voices waiting for the day's docket to begin. Claire sat at the long table in the front of the chamber, her hands folded tightly in her lap, the weight of weeks of threats pressing against her shoulders. Noah and Lily were in the gallery behind her, seated beside Elias Porter, who had agreed to testify. Across the aisle, Evelyn Shaw sat with her lawyers, immaculate in a tailored suit, her expression cool and certain. She carried herself like someone who had already won. The judge entered, his robe brushing against the floor, and the room rose before settling back into silence. He read the case name aloud, his voice steady. Whitmore versus Shaw and Associates, on behalf of certain claimants of the Holbrook estate. Claire's name sounded strange in the formality of court, but she forced herself to sit straighter. Evelyn's attorney spoke first, their words smooth, rehearsed, and sharpened by experience. They argued that the farmhouse was tied to outstanding debts left unresolved when the Holbrook family line died out. They cited obscure property transfers, faded contracts, and foreclosure claims that had never been properly dissolved. By their account, Claire was squatting on land that had never been hers to receive, and the hidden contents, though they never named them outright, belonged to Evelyn's consortium. When Claire's attorney, a quiet man from Montpelier recommended by Elias, rose to respond, he moved with the calm of someone who had spent nights poring over old documents. He laid out the charters Elias had uncovered, each one bearing the Brotherhood's spiral seal. He explained piece by piece that the Holbrook estate was not simple property, but a custodial trust, bound to whomever legally held the deed. The farm had been meant to endure, its vaults protected not as assets, but as preserved wealth for those charged with keeping them safe. Elias was called as a witness. He carried the old portfolio with him to the stand, his tweed jacket worn at the elbows, his voice steady, but alive with conviction. He described the Brotherhood's history, their belief that society moved in cycles of collapse and renewal, their hidden vaults of bonds, ledgers, and artifacts placed under the care of trusted families. He showed the court the succession clause, pointing to the faded ink that made it clear. If the Holbrook line ended, the custodianship of the estate would pass with the deed. Mrs. Whitmore inherited the deed through lawful proceedings, Elias said firmly, holding the judge's gaze. Therefore, she is the trustee, not only of the house, but of what lies beneath it. That is the Brotherhood's own law, and their law was written out last time. Evelyn rose then, her voice smooth as silk, dismissing his testimony as romantic speculation. She argued that secret fraternities held no weight in real courts, that faded seals and coded ledgers meant nothing against financial records and unpaid debts. She leaned on the letter of civil law, pressing the judge to see the farmhouse as little more than decayed property, and her clients as rightful creditors. But when Claire herself was asked to speak, she rose without hesitation. She thought of her family's laughter at her expense, of Richard's mocking toast, of the letters pinned to her gate. She thought of the photographs of the Holbrooks, of the words etched on the second ledger, asterisk for those who endure, asterisk. "I didn't ask for this house," she said, her voice even. "It was given to me because no one else wanted it. They called it worthless. They mocked me for holding on to it. But what I found here wasn't mine alone. It was meant to be preserved, to survive when everything else fell apart. The Holbrooks did their part. Now it's mine to continue. Stewardship isn't about profit. It's about responsibility. And I will not abandon it." The room fell still. Even Evelyn's lawyers shifted uneasily. The judge leaned forward, his eyes on the documents, the charters, the faded seals. He tapped his gavel once, thoughtful rather than final. "Property law recognizes trusts," he said slowly. "And if these papers are authentic, then the Holbrook estate is not simply land. It is a custodial trust with obligations that pass to its inheritor." Evelyn stiffened, her jaw tightening, but the judge raised his gavel again. "The court finds in favor of Mrs. Whitmore. She retains legal stewardship of the Holbrook farmhouse and its holdings. The claims of Shaw and Associates are dismissed." The sound of the gavel striking echoed through the chamber. Claire exhaled, her shoulders loosening for the first time in weeks. Noah's grin broke across his face, Lily clutching her sketch pad with relief. Elias allowed himself a small nod, though his eyes lingered on Evelyn, who gathered her papers in silence, her mask of composure cracking just enough to reveal the fury beneath. Claire left the courthouse with her children at her side, the autumn air sharp and cool against her face. The farmhouse still waited, its vaults silent but steadfast. She had proven her right to it, not just in the eyes of the past, but now in the eyes of the law. But as she walked down the courthouse steps, she knew this battle was only one part of a larger war. Others would come, and when they did, the house and the trust it carried would be ready. The farmhouse breathed differently after the gavel struck in her favor. It wasn't the wood or the stone that had changed, but the way Claire carried herself inside it, where once she walked cautiously, unsure whether the house was a gift or a curse. Now she moved as if she belonged, as if the timbers had finally recognized her. The court had ruled, yes, but the greater verdict had been delivered in the silence of the farmhouse itself. She had endured. In the evenings, when the wind moved through the rafters, she no longer heard only creaks and groans. She heard a rhythm, the echo of lives that had kept watch before her. She thought often of the Holbrooks, of the woman in the sepia photographs whose gaze never wavered. That same resolve now burned in Claire, not because she had found crates of coins or bonds, but because she had faced the ridicule of her family, the pressure of Evelyn's threats, the weight of despair, and had refused to let go. Noah walked the halls with new confidence, his shoulders squared as though the farmhouse itself had become his armor. He no longer muttered about leaving or called the place a ruin. He carried the crowbar less like a weapon and more like a tool, a reminder that discovery belonged to them now. Lily filled page after page of her sketch pad, capturing the chambers, the crates, the symbols, even the fields above. Her drawings were not simply illustrations. They were records, as if she too understood that what they guarded had to be remembered. One evening, as they sat around the dining table, lantern light pooling over the scorched map and the second ledger, Claire laid her hands flat on the wood. Her children looked to her, waiting, and she realized they deserved to hear what had settled in her heart. "This house was never meant to be an inheritance in the way people think," she said softly. "It was never about money or about the land. The Brotherhood didn't choose families because they were rich. They chose them because they could be trusted to endure, to hold on when the rest of the world let go." Lily traced her finger over the words on the ledger's cover. Asterisk for those who endure. Asterisk. Noah leaned closer, his expression fierce. "That's us now," he said. Claire nodded. "Yes, the Holbrooks endured their time, and now it's ours. The money, the bonds, the gold, those are tools. But the true inheritance is this trust, this responsibility. It's about strength, not wealth. And no matter what comes, no matter who tries to take it, we will not let it go." The farmhouse seemed to answer her, the beams above groaning softly as though in agreement. Outside, the fields lay quiet under the pale wash of moonlight, their roots tangled over tunnels and chambers the world had forgotten. For the first time since the divorce, Claire no longer felt like someone left with nothing. She no longer heard Richard's mocking laughter or Denise's warnings as chains around her. She heard only the call of the house, the weight of a trust that was hers to carry forward. She rose from the table, slipping the black iron key into her pocket. The farmhouse was still scarred, still broken in places, but it stood, and so did she.